So thank you for everyone who's joined us so far. My name is Tara Merrigan. I'm a member of the NBCC board, and I'm one of the people who helped launch and initiate the new prize for translation that will be starting for the 2022 publishing year. I have with me a number of translators who will be talking to you tonight, asking about how best to review literature and translation, especially if you don't have access to the source text itself. What we'll be doing is we'll be talking for about 40 minutes, and then at the end we'll be answering Q&A. So please, as you have questions, type them in the Q&A, and we'll move forward from that. Okay, so with me, I have Jeremy Tiang, who is a novelist, playwright, and translator from Chinese. Originally from Singapore, he lives in New York City. His novel, State of Emergency, won the Singapore Literature Prize in 2018. His latest translation, The Letting Party by Li Jinwu, will be published next month. Emma Ramadan translates books of all genres from French. She is the recipient of the Penn Translation Prize, the Albertine Prize, and an NEA Fellowship and a Fulbright for her work. Her recent translations include Abdella Tayaz, A Country for Dying, Kamel Daoud's Zabor or the Psalms, and Anne Garreta's In Concrete. I also have here with me today Samuel Martin, who is the co-editor of Hopscotch Translation. He teaches French at the University of Pennsylvania and has translated works by several contemporary writers, including Jean-Christophe Bailly and Georges Didi Uberman. His translation of Didi Uberman's photo essay Bark was a co-winner of the French American Foundation Translation Prize and was longlisted for the Penn Translation Prize. I have with me as well Kevin Blankinship, who is a professor of Arabic at Brigham University. He is a contributing editor at New Lines magazine. He has written about books and culture for The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Foreign Policy, and more. His translations from Arabic have appeared in academic journals as well as Arab Lit Quarterly and the Ethra Cultural Center in Saudi Arabia. He tweets as @American Maghreb. Shelley Frisch translations from German, which include biographies of Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Einstein, Leonardo da Vinci, Marlene Dietrich / Leni Riefenstahl, and Franz Kafka, along with many other works of fiction and nonfiction, have been awarded numerous translation prizes, including the Modern Language Association's Aldo and Gian Scaglione Prize and the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize. Her translation of Peter Neumann's Jena 1800 for FSG will be published in February, and the following month will see the publication by Princeton University Press of The Aphorisms of Franz Kafka. So thank you all for joining me. So just to start off, I want to ask all of you about the very topic of our conversation. Do you feel like a reviewer should acknowledge in their review that the book is translated and it has a translator?
Yes.
Great.
A resounding yes.
Yes. I was just reading this weekend's New York Times book review section, and there was a review of a new South Korean novel or novella, I think it was, and I was struck by wording in it that that brought the role of the translator so nicely into who is responsible for what. And I jotted it down. It says, in Janet Hung's translation, Kwan's writing is masterly. And I loved the way that it was so compact, but it right away gave you the idea that this is a co-creation, that there's a text and then a translator comes in and reworks it and recreates it. And I've had that a couple of times in reviews of my works, and I'm so gratified by there was one that I jotted down also from my own, between them, Rainer Stach and Shelley Frisch have created, et cetera, and then talk about the language. And a point that I hope to keep coming back to, because it's really important to me, is that in my view, reviewers not only don't need to know the source text in order to see the virtues of a translated text, but that can actually stand in the way, because sometimes I've read reviews of books by people who know the source language, and there's a lot of cherry picking going on. There's, well, this word I would have done differently, and this phrase doesn't exactly match the original. And I think that reviews like that ignore the spirit of the text and the larger context. It's not really about translating the text, but rather the context is everything, as a lot of jokes about translators have as their punchline. We're all about context. And so I would like to see reviewers be daring. Sometimes they think that if they can't read the source text, that it's inaccessible in some way. I would actually argue that it's an advantage. I'll shut up for a moment here, but that's a point that my leitmotif going through this.
Well, Shelley, if I could respond to that, I think these are all part of the same problem, actually. When the fact that a book is a translation or that it has a translator is not mentioned in a review, it comes from the same impulse as not having the translator on the cover of the book or not mentioning the translator in the publicity, which is to regard translation as kind of an embarrassment. And the attitude that it would be better for us all if we just pretended that the book had been written in English, rather than embracing the fact that it has come to us from a different language and probably culture. But if we were to instead foreground the fact that it's a translation, to celebrate the fact that this is a book that has come from outside the language and is so enriching it, I think the same attitude would make knowledge of the source language be approached in the right direction, rather than cherry picking. An engagement with the craft of the translator and an appreciation of what the translator has done, because you can see the journey that the text has made. It's only when you regard translation as a necessary evil, then you see translators as service providers, and it becomes this, as you say, cherry picking exercise, where it's all about accounting. Have I been cheated of a bit of translation? Has a bit of translation been missed out? Rather than positively appreciating what the translator has done and their craft.
And sometimes what translators go well beyond what's even in the text. I think of Jessica Cohen's translation of David Grossman's A Man Walks Into a Bar. It's largely about stand-up comedy. And she actually, with the author's permission, switched out all the jokes. The stand-up jokes wouldn't have worked translated from Hebrew. So she brought in a whole new set of them. And so the text that you read in translation often has come a long journey from the source text. And source text, by the way, my colleague here at Princeton, Karen Emmerich, has written a whole book about how source texts are an elusive thing anyway. There aren't really originals, she argues, in a book length essay. And so a lot of our translations, certainly mine, and this may be true of all of you, have undergone massive transformations, not just changing all the words, which of course they already do, but changing the structure, changing the content, certainly changing the length in many cases. So there's a new book that you're looking at.
I think
seems like a good moment to.
Kevin, over to you.
I was just going to say, I think partly this comes from a faulty view of what authorship is. We have this kind of idea that an author sits there, alone in your sort of author's cell, and sort of creates ex nihilo from your mind and your imagination, whereas a translator is derivative and parasitic. Authors, obviously, as we all know, read and absorb entire traditions, and they're not parasitic by kind of channeling that into their own work, but there's nothing that's created that's not on the backs of people who have come before. So even just being able to acknowledge that an author too is, has this kind of a debt maybe, or, anxiety of influence, as Harold Bloom once put it, in the same way that a translator is working from something from before. If we could get away from this view of the author as sort of a creator god, then that might help as well.
Absolutely.
The example that I had been going to mention, prolonging what you were saying a moment ago, Shelley, about the transformations that a text undergoes through the process of translation. A salient example that comes to my mind is the recent translation of In Memory of Memory by Maria Stepanova, the translation by Sasha Dugdale. And this is a book that is up for numerous translation awards and has garnered a lot of attention. I'd looked at the Amazon reviews the other day, and the first review, which gets a lot of thumbs up, says, "This is a wonderful book. The translation, however, is execrable because it changes many things, leaves pages out, etc. And this is disrespectful toward the reader." But we know that that's not quite, it's not so straightforward as that. And in particular, there's a translator's note included in the book in which Sasha Dugdale takes pains to point out that this is a living text and my translation has been conceived in collaboration with the author, and we have deliberately set out to rework certain things, change some elements of the source text. So that's a message that is important to get out. I think it would be important. I scanned the various reviews that have appeared of In Memory of Memory, and some do mention the translator and in very favorable terms. But I have yet to find a mention of the translator's note itself. And it's not just some incidental feature. We're talking about a constitutive and determining element of the text that's being read. But what was even more striking is that the book itself, In Memory of Memory, is about the way in which memory is imagined and recreated. And there's an episode early on when the narrator is sent by a character to a house that was in her family in previous generations. And the narrator looks around the house and remembers everything and sort of reappropriates this space in her memory, and then finds out later that actually she had been sent to the wrong address and that this was a memory that was entirely invented. And right there, I thought, is an allegory of translation just waiting to be picked up. So it would be wonderful. That doesn't require any knowledge of the source text. I have not seen the source text myself, and perhaps I'm not likely to, but I think it would be possible for a reviewer to engage with the ways that translation might be metaphorized or thematized in a book, which would afford more and more imaginative ways of addressing the fact of translation within a review.
I think there is this sort of dichotomy that we're all talking about, which is, on the one hand, there's this camp of readers, reviewers, publishers who want to pretend that the book is in translation is the same, that there's not something more going on because there's this false narrative that translations don't sell, or that readers are afraid of them, or whatever it is. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are these people who really appreciate all the transformations that translations go through and want to talk about those and want to really, I've been lucky enough to have some reviewers who do speak French, do really wonderful deep dives into all the ways my translations have changed because they've had to, because they're full of jokes or they're full of wordplay or whatever it is. And one of my reviewers, Chris Clark, is in the audience, so I'll give him a shout out. But I think, so we have these two ends of the spectrum, and like, how do we reconcile them? How do we kind of break down this like idea that if a translation is different, then it should either be feared or it should be completely unpacked and celebrated, and like, what is the middle ground? And maybe it's like just kind of getting the acceptance that translation is its own art form and that translations are their own category. And I don't know if I'm not even answering my own question, but I think like we need to figure out how to like marry those two ends of the spectrum when we review translations.
Mhm. Well, one thing that I've noticed, I've served on juries that are for German to English specific translations. And then I've also served on, for example, the Penn Translation Prize jury, where we get submissions from all kinds of languages, and there's no possible jury that would be conversant in all of those languages. And then we don't look at the source texts at any point. And I remember we awarded one of the prizes to a translator from Hebrew, and nobody on our jury knew Hebrew. But it had, there was a character who was well known for, we were told in the book, for malapropisms. And this character would say things like, this person is a tarragon of virtue. And without knowing Hebrew or being able to go back to that, I could see the playfulness, and I assumed it came from the Hebrew, and it was brilliant. And when Evan Fallenberg, who was the translator of this book, was indeed awarded this prize, I called him up in Israel where he lived. He's an American living in Israel. And I singled out some of those phrases, and I said, this was just so beautiful, the way you integrated those offbeat uses of English into your text. And he said, interestingly, reviewers have criticized me for exactly that. They say, well, I'm an American, but I've been living in Israel for so long, I've forgotten English. And, I don't know that it's paragon of virtue. And so, that can play both ways in the reviews when you do these playful changes and stretch the limits of English in different and interesting ways. That can be a double-edged sword that can play for you, as it did for the Penn jury, and it can play against you, as it did for some of the reviewers of this book. Anyway, we awarded him that prize, so I was happy about it.
If I can interject and make a point here, unless someone else, I didn't see anyone unmuting at this moment, but I do want to make sure everyone else has a chance. Just partly this is to do, and this is for reviewers as well, is to look at the purpose of the translation. So often the books that we deal with are written for, that they're sort of trade books or written for a general audience, people we don't expect to know the language. One person who helped me understand, sort of the difference and the usefulness of different kinds of translation is Michael Cooperson, who translated Impostures for the Library of Arabic Literature. This is a series of 50 picaresque rogues' tales from 12th century Baghdad in Arabic. He decided to translate them into 50 different Englishes. So he has middle management speak, he has Chaucerian English in there, and so on. Global Englishes, Nigerian, Singlish, and other things as well. Anyway, one thing Professor Cooperson said to me one time is, if you're writing for an academic audience, there are just certain things that they're looking for in a translation. It's understandable that they would be using translation primarily as a tool to get at the meaning above all else. And in some ways, you can't use sort of a trade translation or something written to be like breezy beach reading on its own as a scholarly tool. So I can understand that, on the one hand, if you're looking at it from that perspective and you're expecting a certain thing out of your translation to be able to use it in a certain way, then you might disparage it. On the other hand, if we're talking about, readers who, come to translation the way they would come to a novel, they're going to sit down and in front of the fire and read it cover to cover or something like that, then it serves a different purpose. So that's something also I try to keep in mind when reviewing and also translating is who am I translating for? And that helps me approach it in a certain way.
Building off Kevin's question, I want to shift our focus a little bit to the kind of work that translators do. So thinking that we're reviewing a book for a general reader, what kind of things have you as translators done in order to make that reading process as smooth as possible? Typically, unless I suppose you're taking an oppositional stance in your translation, which I don't think most translations are taking right now. So what kinds of things should we be looking out for that you spend your time doing, and we should try to acknowledge if we can notice them?
Well, perhaps I would mention again the translator's note, first of all, which might seem like an appendage, but which can serve an extremely useful purpose. I'm thinking, for example, of an essay, a wonderful essay by Jennifer Boom-Mackey, who is a professor of French at Georgetown, which she wrote for Hopscotch Translation a few months ago, which was a review of a graphic novel from French. But the graphic novel dealt with questions of French feminism and had then been translated into English. The change of context was extremely significant, and not all of the references sort of matched up at that point. So Jennifer, in her essay, made an extremely lucid and impassioned plea for translators' notes when possible to address the change not only of language but of cultural context, which can so often play a decisive role in the reception of a translated text.
I reach a lot for the analogy of performance, and I think perhaps how performance and the performative arts are reviewed might be a better analogy for how to review translated books than looking at single authored works. Because theatre and music critics have no problem reviewing both the original script as well as the acting and directing that's laid on top of that, the artistic interpretation of the source, in other words, just as a music critic can review a score as well as the performance of it. And so looking at these, I guess, these two tracks of the source work and the artistic interpretation of that work might be a good way to think of how you can review a book by looking at the underlying text as well as the translation of it, and regarding the translation as an interpretation that's overlaid on an original.
One way in which that pretty much always happens is with retranslations. If there's a new translation of the Odyssey, no reviewer is going to say Homer was a very interesting writer and so on. They're going to focus squarely on the new translation as a performance, as you say, a new performance of an urtext, and see how it plays out in the new translation, which is why retranslations sometimes get the most attention directed at the translator. In fact, that's almost always the case. And so that's the only time I think that it's part and parcel of the reviewing process. I wish it always were, but I think that there it's front and center. When you have other translations that have preceded it, perhaps canonical ones, and then you can see how they play off against each other, which, I sometimes think it's a pity that because so few works get translated into English to start with, that there are so many retranslations. There are economic and other reasons for that in the bookselling business. But the nice tidbit for the translator is that you do get that central attention on what you've contributed to the text that in fact is already known, the way a musical piece might be, or a theater play.
In terms of the I think translators' notes are obviously really important things to engage with when they exist when you're reviewing a translation. I will never forget reading this review in the New York Times, and I won't name the reviewer because I'm not going to shame them, but they were criticizing the translator's choice of how they named a certain character. And the translator's entire translator note was about how they came to that decision and why they came to that exact choice. And this reviewer had clearly not bothered to read the translator's note. And I think that's like number one sin of a reviewer. All the answers are right there. And I think just as every translation is different, the things that would feel important to mention in a review of each translation are going to be wildly different. I mean, I've translated some books and I really felt like, it was like a pretty straightforward translation. And if I don't get mentioned in the review, at all, then that's one thing. But like, I don't really need the reviewer to engage necessarily with like certain choices I made. But then I've translated books where the book has totally transformed, like probably similar to David Grossman's book that we've been talking about. And for if there's a lot of humor in a book, or if there's a lot of kind of intricate stuff happening with the English language that clearly didn't exist until it came into translation, then that's what will need to be engaged with. If it's a really rhythmic book, if it's a really voicey book, it's, I think, what needs to be looked at when you're reviewing a translation is so dependent on the book specifically, and looking at a translator's note or looking at a translator's, I don't know, Twitter feed or something to like get a sense of what it was that was so important to them is just the best place to start.
I can talk about a specific technique that I've seen and used that I think is useful for developing sort of a smooth reading experience while also sort of preserving the strangeness of a work in translation, which is something that we all, I think, value, is this experience of getting a window into a different culture, a different language, is sort of repetition within the text. So what I'm thinking of, for example, is if you have a word from the source language, you might preserve that word in italics or whatever, and then put enough context around it, maybe a parenthesis, kind of parenthetical statement, or other things that you're talking about that word that make it clear to the person, even if they don't know the language, that this is what you're talking about. One example I can think of that does this very well is Celestial Bodies, written by Joha Al-Harthi, who's an Omani professor and novelist. The translator is Marilyn Booth at Oxford, and it won the International Man Booker Prize. She does this wonderful job of inserting, Arabic words and phrases, but giving you enough context, whether from, a sentence kind of restating what it says in the Arabic, or putting enough other things about what they're talking about. So it's almost like having a footnote within the text itself, but in sort of an organic way that works with the text, and then also, again, preserves this sort of, I don't want to say strangeness, because we're trying to be generous to the cultures that we're translating from, but this essential kind of difference, I guess, from one language to another that you can preserve in this way.
And along those lines, there's an increasing tendency not to italicize foreign words that are used. I mean, I know with Arabic, there's also a transliteration issue, but not to italicize foreign words in the text, in that same sense of drawing in the reader through stealth glossing, or in some way, the repetition, as you say, making it part of the fabric of the text, so that it no longer is a standalone foreign word, but actually a core of the new text, which is an exciting development.
Thank you all. So one of the things that I want to think about a little bit more is, so we've noticed that in some translations there will be adjectives that are applied to in some reviews there are adjectives that are applied to translations. If you would just for fun list some of your favorite and least favorite that you've seen, and obviously here we're trying to engage more with getting reviewers to move beyond adjectives to describe the translator's work, because as we're talking, it's a much more comprehensive process that deserves more than an adjective.
I understand that we all love synonyms for things, but if I see another translation described as muscular, I'm going to jump out a window. Please, let's talk about smooth, breezy, whatever, but muscular prose, it's just.
I think you muted yourself midway through, Kevin.
I didn't know.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm also not in the business of like canceling words. We're all linguists. We understand that, language has a way of growing organically around the barriers we try to put on it, but please, muscular, let's come up with some other adjectives.
Well, there are fads for these things. I mean, one thing I will say in defense of the sort of weakling one word adjectives, deft, fluid, and whatever, the things that we sort of groan about, but at the same time, it's better than nothing. I have to say that if I find that the text goes for just one of those things that you might call weak tea or something, it still says, I recognize that the translator is an active partner in this. To answer Tara's question, I jotted down a few things that I loved in reviews of books that I've translated. Michael Dirda once wrote about one of my books that the prose feels excited, dynamic, utterly alive. And that's not very specific, but at the same time, it gives a sense of the spirit of the text. I've never really known exactly what deft means for a translation, but I've been defted so many times that it seems to be just one of those filler words. It doesn't seem to, in itself, carry any meaning. I had a recent review that was so lovely because it went beyond the one work that was being reviewed and said that I was said to be one of the nimblest and liveliest translators working today, and that the English was leaps off the page with deadline urgency. And you know, it's again coming back to Tara's original question: do you need to know the source language to be able to say something muscular about it? I don't think so. I think you can see, in fact, I'm sure that, you know, you can see when these words, if words do in fact leap off the page, it's not really interesting, I think, to go back to the German and find out whether they were sprinting in quite the same way. But, you know, your new text has maybe something, an exciting dimension, whatever it might be. And when reviewers notice that, you know, a lot of the things that we translators do, we think are sort of private jokes when we have our aha moments and we say, oh, this is perfect. I love, you know, that these two words, I don't know, have a certain kind of alliteration or whatever it might be, but no reader will ever notice it. And then when someone does, it's a very exciting thing. So I'd like to see reviewers maybe go past muscular and, you know, but I'll take muscular as opposed to being left out altogether.
I agree with Shelley. I think while it is a bit of a cliche, whenever I get a smooth or a deft or yes, a muscular, I receive that as the reviewer wishing to say something positive about the translation and to acknowledge it, even if they don't know exactly how to engage. And I received that with the kindness with which it was intended. But I have to say, Sam Sachs in the Wall Street Journal called my translation of Yenka's Strange Beasts of China enjoyably rococo. And in that moment, I felt very seen.
That's a nice one. Yeah, I remember reading that review. And congratulations on that book.
I think I agree with Jeremy and Shelley in that I feel very hesitant to kind of nitpick the language that reviewers use, because I think a lot of reviewers do struggle, which is why we're having this panel. A lot of reviewers struggle to know how to engage with translations, and so making it seem like we're like waiting in the wings to jump out and criticize them the same way we feel like they're waiting in the wings to criticize us is not useful. And also, I've never had the muscular compliment. I'm feeling a little left out. But I think like the like absolute no-nos are the sort of words that imply that the translation is good because the translator is invisible or like not noticed, or that their role isn't really there. And I think we're like past that now. But the seamless thing that someone put in the chat, when you say seamless, you're kind of implying that you don't notice it and therefore it is good, and kind of equating the lack of like having to acknowledge that the book is a translation with being a positive thing. I think we all need to like stay away from, and that's kind of my one rule. And then I similarly, I would take any adjective really over nothing, but adjectives that just feel specific to, they feel like the reviewer read the book, you know, like ably translated doesn't mean anything. But saying that something is enjoyably rococo means something, right? Like they read the book, they understood what was happening. And I guess my favorite compliment I ever got until the day I get muscular is that I translated this book that mentions the American translator of it. And so I put my own name in the book because I was the American translator of that book. It's called Revenge of the Translator. And I had this like really crazy review by Archie Azizi in the LARB that called my translation subversive because I'd put myself into it. So I enjoyed that.
I appreciate the kind of struggle that we're all dealing with, which is, to have an aesthetic experience and put it into words. And it's such a cliche that this would be, what we're all dealing with. But, I was reading the other day, the Matthew Arnold's essays on translating Homer. And, I don't know classical Greek. And so I've never read Homer in the original Greek. And so watching Matthew Arnold try to describe to the reader, why this person's translation accesses what he sees as, sort of a fast-paced rhythm and also simple elegance of language, and trying to put that into words. He ends up using lots of examples, which he quotes, of course, in Greek, and then, uses other translations, to try and get at this idea. But I think this is part of the problem is, when you only have, 500 to 800 words to lay out your case for, what went well, what might have been improved in this translation, and you're trying to wrap your words around something that's kind of a transcendent experience, this aesthetic encounter. That can be, I think, the fundamental difficulty.
I wonder if it might be freeing for some reviewers to think about criticism as a form of translation, insofar as the reviewer, the critic, looks for their own words with which to extend the reach and resonance of the text. So rather than feeling constrained within a very small set of metaphors and images that are often rehashed, to continue to seek imaginative new ways of speaking about any book, whether it be a translated book or not. But I certainly agree with Shelley and everyone else when I say that better that it be mentioned and acknowledged than not at all.
I think anything that comes across as finger wagging at reviewers who may already be somewhat nervous about reviewing a translation where they don't know the source language. If we introduce arguments that seem more chastising. Well, if you didn't know it in German, how could you possibly know what the translation is like? And a reviewer himself or herself may feel that saying anything better than or more specific than ably translated would be I don't know, hubris or something to say, without knowing the source language. So there could be a lot of uncertainties on the part of reviewers. We are happy. I think I've heard everyone say that we're happy to get, any adjective you'll give us, preferably positive ones. And if they're a little time worn, that's okay too.
I think I should also say that there is no right or wrong way, no single right or wrong way to review a translation. And the reason they come under such scrutiny is so few translations get published and so few of those get reviewed. So everything that does then comes under a microscope. And what we really need in our society is an abundance of publications and reviews of translated work. And then there can also be a multiplicity of approaches, and then we can stop worrying about whether this or that way is right. They're all right. They're all good.
I had two quick thoughts about this. One of them is, oh, sorry, Tara, did you want to move us along?
Please. I was good.
I see
No. Let's keep going. Okay. You have your thought, and then I'll ask one more question. Then we'll transition.
Yeah, partly this is a larger issue, which has to do with reviewer ethos. What kind of persona do you want to construct when you are approaching a work? And of course, we all know this about reviewers. Marilyn Robinson said in one essay, and I love this example, she says there are reviewers who are spankers and reviewers who are strokers. So like wonderfully delightful erotic language here. And she says, I'm a stroker. I'm the kind of person who, when I review a book, I review it because I liked it and I want to tell people about it. That's the first thing I had. You know, is it better to have bad press than no press at all? Oscar Wilde said that the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. So, you know, I guess, you know, we leave it to each individual person to decide whether a bad review is better than no review at all. But I agree with everyone that, you know, especially with literature and translation, more reviews are better than fewer.
Absolutely. We've been talking about one last question. We've been talking about translators as a co-creator of an aesthetic experience. I also want to talk about the work that translators do in ferrying a given text from one culture to another culture. So some of you have mentioned leaving words in their original and having some sort of phrase that explains them or a parenthetical. But of course, there's a lot more to bringing one work from a specific culture into the Anglophone culture. So if you would reflect on the kind of work that you do, such that reviewers could then perhaps better understand that work.
Well, so I'll just jump in. Some of the things are not cultural per se, but they're embedded in the language, and the language that you choose defines how you're bringing the one culture to the, just an example from German, there's a much more excited use of punctuation, lots of exclamation points and so on. I remember I translated one book that had lots of those, and I cut out about 75% of them for the English translation. And my editor came to me and said, you know, your text has too many exclamation points. Okay, I'll take out more. And it was down to, you know, 90% of them were gone in the end. German, again, this is still on the level of language. German syntax has a sort of crescendo movement. You say all the unimportant stuff. German sentences are very long. You say all the unimportant stuff at first, and then it sort of crescendos toward the end where you finally make the big point. It's sort of like telling a joke and the punchline comes at the end. And so one of the decisions you have to make as you're translating, I'm sure that all languages that we deal with have things like this, that you have to decide, do you want to keep that crescendo effect, which is really linguistically determined in German? It's called increasing news value. Or do you want to switch it over to a more English appropriate syntax, in which case you lose some of that flood of language sort of about to crash as it reaches the shore. So these are the kinds of, this is not specifically answering your question of moving the culture, but the language does in some way shape the cultural impact.
And my very quick answer to your question, Tara, would be to respond not as a translator myself in this case, but as an editor, just to recommend to readers some of the outlets where contributors are expressly encouraged to reflect at length about these questions of translation, cultural mediation, etc. I can obviously speak for Hopscotch, but in addition, I would earnestly recommend reading in translation, Asymptote, Words Without Borders. There are many outlets out there where reviewers pay close attention to these subtle but important linguistic and cultural considerations. So if you're seeking inspiration for ways in which these questions can be addressed, then those are some good starting points.
Would you talk a little bit more about Hopscotch's approach, Sam? I realize we didn't properly introduce it. So
not at all. But Hopscotch is an online journal which has been running almost exactly a year now, because we launched in January, and which grew out of a book reading series at a bookshop in Pennsylvania before the shop was closed on account of the pandemic, unfortunately, but we then transitioned online. And very simply, it's a space for writers, specifically translators, but not exclusively, reviewers and readers and publishers as well, to engage with the kinds of questions about literary translation that book reviews in more traditional outlets might not have the space or time for. So many of our contributors are translators themselves, and at Hopscotch, we try to foster the understanding that translation is writing, is creative writing, and affording a space to translators to make that as explicit as possible.
Oh, sorry, Jeremy, you go ahead. Okay. I was going to say, speaking of Words Without Borders and Hopscotch, there is on Words Without Borders, there is this lovely article about reviewing translations by Susan Bernofsky, Jonathan Cohen, and Edith Grossman, if anyone is sitting and wanting to hear more about this stuff. But I think on the topic of cultural ferrying, they have this point in their like checklist about considering the way that the translation they are reviewing is contributing to the literary life of the English language, is how they put it. And I think beyond the like nitty gritty stuff that we do as translators, if reviewers are approaching a translation they don't have access to the original of, or just want to think about it in general, I mean, I think the reason why a lot of us are drawn to the books we pitch and translate is because they're doing something that we're not seeing in English, and they're doing something that doesn't exist, isn't either because of the way the English language works, or the culturally, or the literary scene here, or whatever it is. I mean, we want to translate this book because it's contributing something to English, and sort of making dents in the English language, and kind of expanding what English can do or needs to do. And a lot of us face these issues when we're translating of, oh gosh, this is not a thing that English does. What am I supposed to do? And then you find a way, right? There's always a solution. And usually that solution means that you've changed the way you use, and we all use English in some way. And I think that's a really easy thing for reviewers to be able to see and comment on without having access to any kind of original, because we all have access to English and we all know what English typically looks like. And so even just thinking on that more abstract level of what we are doing as translators, what we are bringing into English, how we are kind of like contaminating the English language as we know it, I think is an easy entry point for reviewers.
I mean, we're here talking about a fairly small portion of what else translators do, the more romantic cultural mediation side, and not the tortuous three-way correspondence between the publisher and the rights agent before we finally got permission to pitch the book. With Chinese, there's a kind of deficit in terms of how much has been written versus how much has been translated or read on average in the English-speaking world. So I often have the dilemma of, here is a line that's a quote from a Tang Dynasty poem. How do I not make it sound forbidding the way Tang Dynasty poem does to many American readers, and instead convey the familiarity of this is a line from a poem that everyone has memorized in grade school and should be utterly familiar, and trying to navigate across that gap and try to put the reader who may not be as familiar with these cultural elements in the position of someone who is, can require a lot of camouflaged glossing and planting seeds way ahead of when they need to appear in the text. And that kind of work often is invisible but necessary.
One thing that comes to mind as I think about translators' roles in terms of this cultural midwifery would be even introducing new categories of literature. So, once upon a time, I'd love to hear more about how things like the haiku or the pantoum entered sort of the Anglophone, imagination in the realm of poetry. From Arabic, there are all these wonderful genres that just aren't talked about in English as part of sort of the cultural conversation that we have. So again, I go back to Michael Cooperson's translation of Impostures. The maqama is a specific genre in Arabic of sort of these picaresque tales, and we can call them picaresque tales, but that's not quite exactly what they are. Another great example is a book called Names of the Lion, and it's by David Larson, or it's translated by David Larson at NYU. And this is a book that is simply a list of over 400 names for a lion, like just names for lions, with some explanation. And it's wonderful reading in Arabic, but it's the kind of thing that unless you're the kind of person who would go to the OED and just browse and sort of pick out things and read it for pleasure, this is a genre that might be unfamiliar to a lot of readers, and we might call it something like philological pleasure reading, the kind of thing that you just sit down and you really dig deep into the roots of words and where they come from, and sort of the morphology and things like that. Again, it's great, it's playful, but not sort of the thing that you would have introduced without a translator.
Great. Thank you all for your answers and your thoughtful reflections. I do want to switch to our Q&A portion of this webinar. And I'm looking through the Q&A and I see that Mayred Stade has asked a question regarding the Kate Briggs book on translation. So I'm going to read her question aloud. In her book, This Little Art, Kate Briggs talks about how we too often conceive of translation as selfless, involving apparently the least of the practitioner's self, except perhaps when it's thought to have been done badly. Are there ways we critics and readers might better appreciate the foreground itself and even the audacity of a translator, as we would that of an author, rather than falling back on the received perception of it as somehow presumptuous or wrong? So it's a meaty question.
I mean, I think we're back to performance as an analogy, or at least I am. Maybe I never leave. But I don't always choose to translate a text because I think it will enrich the culture or the language, or because I think it's an important text. Sometimes I choose to translate a text because I think it will be fun, or because I think it will be a creative challenge, or stretch me, or stretch my voice. And we are quite used to actors talking about choosing a particular role because they thought it would be a good fit for them, or because they thought they would bring something of themselves to it. And I think it's fine for translators to approach it in the same way. I chose to translate this book because I thought it would be artistically satisfying. I think that's okay.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jeremy. People have always asked me, how do you choose the texts that you want to translate? And sometimes I do mostly nonfiction, as you know. And I'll say that sometimes it's because I'm already quite familiar with that subject and I want to know more what this author has done with it. And sometimes it's because I know nothing about the subject. I translated a very lengthy book called Eunuchs and Castrati. That was a subject matter about which I knew very, very little. And yet I got so involved in the subject, which maybe says something weird about me, but I got so involved in it that in the end, I actually wound up writing an additional, the book stopped with the 19th century opera Castrati. And I found a development in India in the 20th century that had not been covered in the book. And I wound up writing an additional chapter about it because I was so excited about it with the author's permission and the publisher's permission. So I think that a lot of what we choose to do in our translations is for the pure personal fun of it. I don't always feel so altruistic about my translations. I feel as though this is something that will enrich me. And if it enriches me, I think that many authors say this too. I write what I want to write. And then ideally, I'll find readers who enjoy it also. And I think that that's how I feel about my translations. I hope that readers out there enjoy it, but I want to make sure I have fun in the process as well.
I think this is where Hopscotch and places like it are doing really important work on this front, because I think if we can sort of as a culture become comfortable with the fact that translations are different, that they are a different book, that they are different depending on who is translating them, that we as translators all have different kind of reference points and we're all subjective and we're all human, and therefore the spin we put on a translation is going to be very specific to us. If we can all just like be cool with that and not freak out about it, and then give more space for translators to write about their process. I mean, I think this is happening a lot right now. Hopscotch is part of that. And we're seeing, even in big publications like the Paris Review, the New Yorker, the New York Times, translators writing about their process and their personal relationship to the text and kind of what they brought to it or what it brought to them. I think more of that kind of thing, this little art is part of that too. All of that is kind of helping to foreground that we are individuals who are doing a certain kind of art, and that the book that you're reading is sort of inflected by who we are as individuals.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, some of the pieces that I have most enjoyed reading in not only in Hopscotch but elsewhere, Kate Briggs and your own writing, Emma, have been precisely when the translator doesn't speak necessarily from a kind of high and mighty position of authority, but talks about their vulnerability and the difficulties that they've had, whether it be with the actual active translation or, Jeremy, as you were saying a little while ago, about the nitty-gritty, painstaking, and often discouraging process of securing the rights and so forth. The more awareness there is among the literary community, among reviewers, among readers of what goes into this process, I think the better off everybody will be.
Speaking as an educator, this is something that could also be addressed in the classroom. I remember being in a world literature class and reading things like, the Iliad or Anna Karenina, and, having the professor not make a big deal about the fact that we weren't actually reading. We were reading an interpretation of Anna Karenina or Homer. And so even just being able to take a moment and say, now what you're reading is, a labor from a person who had to, bring this in and make choices about what's going on anyway. And it doesn't have to be a big thing, but just pointing that out and making it clear that that's what's going on.
So we have 4 minutes left. I want to give you all a chance for closing remarks or anything you felt like you wanted to say today but didn't have the chance. It went very quickly. It was a wonderful discussion.
I think Jeremy's point earlier about just getting more reviews of translation and not being afraid that not every box is being checked, or that something that you're not engaging in the right way. As long as you are engaging in some way with the fact that the book you are reading is translated and is translated by an individual who has made individual choices, as long as there's some kind of acceptance of that and not an attempt to hide from it or obscure it, then you can't really go wrong. And I just wholeheartedly agree with what Jeremy said. We just need more.
I see that in the chat, someone, Adam at Words Without Borders, has encouraged attendees to pitch him. So hopefully there will be more reviews of literature and translation very soon. Okay. If there's no other remarks, we'll
Sorry, I was going to make one more point. Be willing to branch out, I guess is what I would say. Someone, put in the chat, I think, or in the Q&A, how do we get more reviewers to review more literature and translation? Again, going off of Jeremy's point and Emma's point, be willing to take risks and sort of ask yourself always, am I branching out? Am I looking at a title that I normally wouldn't look at? That kind of thing. I think there's a lot of, and for understandable reasons, a lot of inertia in the business that sort of prevents you from stretching yourself and taking risks and trying new things. So even just having that in mind and being willing to experiment a little bit more, I think would go a long way.
And to circle back to the initial point that you raised in your first question, Tara, that reviewers can not worry about whether or not they know the source text, that the text as it stands in its published form in its new linguistic garb is the product that is out there for readers and reviewers to engage with, to love, to write about.
That's great. So thank you all for your thoughts. We've had such an incredible panel here. So lucky to be able to reflect with you about how reviewers might best approach translations. And I think some of the underlying points sounds like be bold, but still remember the translator, if that seems correct. Okay, so again, I just want to remind everyone that this panel was held because the NBCC will be launching a new prize for literature and translation starting next year. And NBCC members will be partaking in the judging of that prize. So if anyone who is an NBCC member or would like to join the NBCC has any questions, please email me. My name is Tara Merrigan, and my email is on our board page on the website. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon. It's evening here for me, but thank you for your attendance and your time.
Thanks, everyone. This was lovely.
Thank you.
It's really nice.
Thank you.